Hi, macro students. Here we are on our Module 48 um, video lecture talking about real GDP. So Module 47 was about GDP. Module 48 is about real GDP. And we have to keep in mind that they are different. They're very, very similar, but we need to know what the differences are. So first we're going to discuss what is the point of GDP, right? Like last module, we figured out that the government, they try to add together everything that everybody has spent in a year, the expenditure approach, to figure out how much was produced in a year, and then come up with this huge number of like $21 trillion. And that's a really hard job to do, to try to figure that out. And knowing that number, $21 trillion, how does that number help us? Well, if we want to compare the US's economy to China's economy, we can know the GDP of both economies, and that is helpful to know which country has the bigger economy. But like it says here, what if we want to be able to compare one year to another year? Well, what is the purpose of knowing the 2020 US GDP compared to the 2019 US GDP? Well, that would be to know if the US economy is getting bigger or getting smaller. Because remember, when the economy is getting bigger, that means that it usually means that more people have jobs, which is a good thing. And when the economy is getting smaller, that usually means that unemployment is raising, which means that fewer people have jobs, which is a bad thing. And so they want to know about that to see if there is anything that the government can do or should do to help out that situation. Well, there's a problem, though, with comparing these GDPs of 2019 versus 2020 because there is inflation. And we learned last module, that inflation rises at about 2 to 3% a year on a normal year. Well, if the GDP goes up, we don't really know if it went up because output increased because the economy produced more goods and services, or if it was because inflation happened. And so that is confusing and misleading because what we really want to know is, did GDP change because of output changing? Inflation is a different matter. If we're trying to figure out if output changed, we don't want inflation to get in the way of that number, of that knowledge. So therefore, they create something called real GDP. Now, real GDP is just regular old GDP, but it has been adjusted for inflation. So they do some math. They choose a year to base prices off of. And then if the inflation rate was 3% between year one and year two, then they will adjust the GDP down by 3% to get the real GDP. And what that does is it allows us to compare years to see what the economy did. If the economy grew, if the economy shrank, or if there was no change. And by that, we mean in terms of output. Did output increase? Did output decrease? Did output stay the same? So when we're talking about the output of an economy, we are actually talking about the real GDP of an economy. Same thing. Output equals real GDP. Same thing. Okay. And again, output or real GDP means the amount of stuff, meaning goods and services, that the economy produced. So let's go through this little fake example here. So we have year one, and in year one, we're gonna, pretend that this little tiny economy here produced 20 of good X, right? 20 widgets or 20 gadgets, whatever. 20 of good X. And the price of good X was $5. Well, you would go 20 times 5 and their GDP would be $100. And their real GDP would also be $100 because year one is the base year. So that's what we base our numbers off of. Okay, so let's add that in, year one, base year. Year two, they produce 20 of good X. The price is now $10. So the GDP, which is just 20 times 10, is $200. So if we just had the GDP numbers for this scenario, if we just had that GDP was $100 and now GDP is $200, we might think, wow, that economy got bigger. Their output increased. But if we figure out the real GDP, which means that we use the base year price of $5 times the output of that year, the number produced, which is 20, then we're back to $100. So this $100, that was gotten by 20 times 5, and that number 5 came from over here, the base year price. So now we see that in year one, the real GDP is $100, and in year two, the real GDP is still $100, and that tells us that output did not change. The regular GDP numbers did not tell us that. When the regular GDP goes up, we don't know if it went up because of inflation, because prices increased, or because of output increasing. But with real GDP, yes, then we know. When you're comparing the real GDP of 2 years in a country, then if the number for real GDP increases, you know for certain that it increased because output increased. But regular GDP, we just don't know. Okay, I'm going to pause the video there. That's the end of part 1.